If you think you are a fan of the final frontier, but you would like a novel that just really challenges your perception of Alaska and what it would be like to live in the harsh winter of Alaska, then today's book just might be for you. Today, we are looking at The Great Alone by Kristin Hannah. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at a book that I just became aware of, although it has come to my attention that this author is actually someone that has a lot of books that are quite popular at the moment. I think she's been writing for several decades now, but in the last just 10 years or so, she's had quite a few books that have really stood out. Kristin Hannah, who has become famous for The Nightingale, Firefly Lane, The Great Alone, and just recently The Women. I have read and reviewed The Women, and I am now doing a review for The Great Alone, and the other books are on my to-read list. And I just want to say that I find her writing style very engaging from the get-go. And I find it fascinating that she becomes really invested in exploring the culture of the 1970s in particular. I wouldn't say it's like a lost decade or anything, but I'd certainly say that it is a decade for which a good deal of people that are starting to read now or are starting to be more selective about the books that they choose that aren't so much dictated by what they have to read in high school. I find it interesting that it seems to be especially popular with that group of people, even though most of those people, so millennials and younger, I would say they have virtually no understanding of the importance of the culture of the 1970s, but she is really leaning into this, and it's obvious because it is part of her life. So The Great Alone, just to give you a quick synopsis of this book in particular, it's set predominantly in 1974, although I've noticed in at least the two books by Kristin Hannah that I've read, she doesn't really have a tight timeline. She tends to use a pretty long time period to tell stories. I personally don't always like that. I think that sometimes it makes it just a little harder for the book to be a page turner, but I will say that the majority of this story takes place in 1974. It follows the Albright family, which you quickly discover is a family of a mother, a father, and a daughter that have lots of issues. The main character, the one telling the story, Leni, she is at the beginning of the book 12, I think, and over the course of the book, she makes it through high school, and then you see even a little beyond high school, but that would be the bulk of it. And you discover that her father, Ernt, is suffering from PTSD. He not only fought in Vietnam, but he was captured in Vietnam, was tortured, lost some very close friends in the POW camps. And so, for all these reasons, he is just having a lot of problems, especially maintaining any kind of work. He is frequently fighting with his employers. He is also very frequently dependent on alcohol. They don't say any other drugs, but he just certainly has a dependency on alcohol. And just like anyone that served in Vietnam, he does struggle with getting any kind of real assistance, not just because there wasn't as much of it at the time, but also I think a culture of machoism and just a resistance to really try to get any kind of therapeutical help is really something that is holding him back, and it leads to him being very impulsive. And so the book starts with him choosing to move to Alaska, and not just Alaska. We're talking middle of nowhere Alaska, which I realize by definition most of Alaska is already considered middle of nowhere, but they are far out there. They don't even have any city or town that is well, first of all, where they live they have to get to by ferry or by seaplane, and therefore they just simply are very removed. They say how big the community is, I forget, but it's only like maybe 100 people, if that. There is a town, a very small town, that has some of the things that they need. There is a small school that Leni is going to go to. I believe she's the only one her age, except of course there will be a little love interest that she is quickly going to fall for. She meets on her first day there, and she is going to have to spend the rest of her time in Alaska learning what it's like to live in Alaska in the dead of winter, when you just don't have many resources, when no matter how much wood you cut, you just can't seem to keep your cabin warm, and of course getting enough supplies that can make it all the way through the winter, even though they are going to plant a garden and they're going to have animals and just all the things that are really going to be a challenge. Of course, all of that is with the backdrop of her father's problems, and you discover that her father, in addition to having problems with drinking and all the other issues that he has, he is very violent. This is something that Leni didn't initially realize, but as things are really getting bad, especially with the harsh Alaska winters, she discovers that her father is violent towards her mother, and then there will even be times near the end of the book that he will be more violent towards her. And that actually is going to lead us to one of the most pivotal moments in the book, is when he is going to be incredibly violent towards her. I won't tell you exactly what happens. It's not exactly a mystery book, at least that's not how I would characterize it, but I would say that that would be telling you just a little too much of the plot, and I would encourage you to read it if you want to know what happens, what Leni does, what the rest of her family does, and what the consequences are for this small community. And of course, I did mention there is a love interest of Leni's that will also play out. I don't know exactly how to characterize it. It is very much an important part of the book. It's not quite the central purpose of the book, though. I would say that the relationship with her parents, and really the relationship between her parents, is really the thing that I would say defines this book. But I don't want to undermine the romantic interest as well. That definitely plays a big part. And I think that's enough of a summary to give you an idea generally of what you should expect from this book. Understand that it is a teenage girl, mostly through high school, dealing with her father's issues and everything that he has because of the war in Vietnam and the fact that he was a POW. Those are going to be the core tenets of this, and I've already said this, but just his issues with domestic violence in particular are going to be the things that she is trying to balance and the things that she is trying to better understand. With that being said, I have to say that I don't know enough about domestic violence to know how good of a representation this is. I don't know if it is being a helpful story in telling the real life reactions to individuals, or if this is possibly maybe presenting it in an erroneous way. I'm not saying it is. To be crystal clear, I don't know. And I do just want to say, if anyone does have more experience or more information about that, I would really appreciate it if you put some kind of comment to clarify whether you thought that this was an appropriate depiction, a fair depiction, or if it was a depiction that could further exacerbate issues with domestic violence. With that being said, I would have to say that I did enjoy this book. Now, not necessarily in some like fun adventure way. They went and lived in Alaska. There are definitely the elements of it that are struggling to understand exactly what her father Ernst is going through, and what her mother is going through, and what she's going through, and also what it takes to balance your own pride and your relationship in a larger community. Well, rather small, yet a slightly larger community than your immediate family. And I don't know for sure who it's intended for. I've read that this is semi-autobiographical. I'm not sure what parts of that are. I just know that Kristin Hannah did grow up in Alaska, in a pretty remote part of Alaska. I certainly hope that there weren't the same issues with domestic violence, but I don't know. I haven't done further research on that. So who would I recommend this book for? I think it's really well written. I'm regretting that I'm just now becoming aware of Kristin Hannah's writing. I think she does an excellent job. And I do think that if you think that the 1970s could be interesting to you, then this is certainly going to appeal to you. I know that might seem kind of specific, but it seems to be a key part of not just this book, but at least the other books of hers that I have read or have read summaries of. It seems that she has a real compassion for the 1970s, because that's when she grew up. And I think that that's interesting that this is currently having a moment. It's having some resonance, especially with a population that I don't think can directly relate to the 1970s. They feel much more removed, such as myself, or really any of my siblings. We would all think, well, that's just a little before our time. And I feel like right now, when we discuss the past, the 1970s, it is frequently a less cited decade. I feel like there's much more about considering the 1960s and the free love movement or the counterculture, and then we have the 1980s with the this rise of conservatism and the Reagan Revolution. And I feel like the 1970s, by and large, can be again, I don't want to say forgotten, but at least it can kind of get split and just segmented into one of those two, when I think by and large it has much of its own culture that should be explored. And I think this is a great book for doing that, at least to a certain extent, obviously considering that it's relatively small in its geographical scope. But regardless, I certainly think it's valuable for considering the impact, especially of the Vietnam War. So who is this book not for? Well, again, domestic violence is a big part of it. And so I would say that it's probably not for anyone that's going to have a problem with that, or just doesn't think that's going to interest them. I did say that there is a love interest, but again, I wouldn't characterize it as, some kind of love interest, love conquers all. The whole point of the story is the love of these two young individuals getting together. That is certainly a part of it, but again, I wouldn't say it's the defining characteristic of this book. So I do think that you should also be aware of that if you're coming to this hoping that there is definitely that romantic story. And I will say, even with that, there's a lot of sadness to it. So just be aware of that. I'd also say that if you're going to take issues with reading about just the consequences of being a Vietnam veteran, such as PTSD, or again, issues of it in terms of the larger culture and how they treated Vietnam vets as depicted in this book, that may also be something that may not interest you. But otherwise, I would recommend this book to most people that are ready to engage with the book, that is going to really extend their ability to engage with a high school girl's experience in a far off place with a lot of different forces that are impacting her life, and yet at the same time she is really doing her best to make the best of a situation which she has very little say in. And I would say that's the heart of this book. In this way, there is certainly a survivalist element to this book that I think could appeal to most people. Of course, I'd love to know what everyone else has to say about this book. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this book, or you actually think that one of Kristin Hannah's books is probably a better representation of her general style, or you just think it's a better book. Please let me know. I would love more engagement, particularly on a book of this nature. Of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.